Okay, welcome everybody. We're in for a treat today with our speaker, Devlin Liles, the Chief Consulting Officer at Improving. You know, in our tech-obsessed world, we often think the latest gadget or software is the key to business success, but Devlin's here to shake things up a bit. He's going to show us how, believe it or not, technology can sometimes get in the way of real progress. Drawing from his wealth of experience, Devlin will walk us through some eye-opening examples of when tech goes wrong in business. He'll shed light on why simply chasing the newest trends isn't always the smartest move. But don't worry, this isn't just about pointing out problems. Devlin's got practical advice on how to make tech work for you, not against you. You'll leave here with fresh ideas on how to make smart tech choices that actually drive your business forward. Throughout the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A button to submit your questions. I'll be collecting them and reading them to Devlin during our discussion. So are you ready to challenge some common assumptions and learn how to unlock real value from your tech investments? Then let's give a warm welcome to Devlin Liles.
Thank you, Daniel. I am definitely looking forward to today's conversation. Now, before we get started, let me kind of lay the deck for you. So this is one part of a 12-part series, kind of digging into the biggest challenges we've seen in the tech industry and the industries that leverage tech to differentiate themselves over the last 18 months to 2 years. We've heard over and over the wave of innovation and AI and all these things that are going to change the world. But is the world ready for change? And so this is going to be sharing some of those learnings. We're going to start with kind of a very high level, kind of C-suite overview of the different trends we've seen targeted at executives. And then it's going to dig into the details of those over the next few weeks together. And so you'll hear me talk about some concepts, and then I'm going to defer you to a much smarter person than I am, who's going to dig into those different areas. And you'll see those kind of themes emerge over the next few weeks. So with that level set of expectations, let's dive in. Now, first, this is me. Probably everything you need to know about me personally. I am a geek. I am a lifelong learner. And I came from a technology background and then grew into business leadership and have continued down that path. And so I have the kind of odd middle ground at the moment of being able to understand the technology trends, but then also see their business impact with a little bit more clarity because of understanding how the technology works and seeing what's stumbling blocks are in our way on the way to that technology innovation. The reason I bring this up is we're going to have to face this paradox of technology. It serves as both an enabler to our business and a barrier to progress. And so we have to manage this kind of threefold complexity of the AI as enablement, technology as enablement, the data as enablement. But then it becomes a barrier when it's built incorrectly or it's aging well beyond its useful life. And so we end up in these times where we want progress in technology, but our previous decisions have held us back. But then trying to be on the bleeding edge has the other side of the coin, where instead of saving costs, we created risk. We spent so much to be bleeding edge that we now have added risk to our business. And so in that role of guiding a company, we have to balance these three perspectives. How do I stay current enough to not be a hindrance to the business? How do I stay, proven technology enough to not create risk? And then doing both of those, how do I optimize cost? And that's not an easy balance to strike, but it is the paradox of what we've seen over the last few years. Companies who wanted to go from aged technology platforms to leveraging AI saw price tags that scared them, because the costs had to get the technology to current and then to start leveraging some of these innovations that have happened in the last few years. We're going to talk about a few specific areas and some examples of how this plays out. Now, the first one is technology as an enabler. We have seen this over the last 20 years. Technology has really streamlined processes with things like RPA and tools like UiPath and Power Platform, Power Automate, app scripts for workspaces in the Google space. We've seen a lot of these technologies bring process streamline to the forefront. We've seen it enhance in productivity, and customer engagement with brands and different mechanisms and omnichannel has never been higher. Now, those enablements are built on top of a whole bunch of things that end up becoming barriers. Whether that is rushing into a technology choice because it's the hot new thing, or whether it's good intention but bad implementation. Now, the fun part about this one is good implementation, if not maintained over time, can become bad implementation. Just because they were good decisions 6 years ago, if they don't stay maintained and up to date and patched and innovated on, they slowly turn from asset to barrier. It's something that in technology we have to constantly fight against, is this attrition of value out of a technology platform as it gets harder to maintain and older, right? There's still COBOL running the world today, but it's significantly harder to maintain. It's going to hold you back on the ability to do certain things. Now, that's not an advocacy for the bleeding edge, but it is something that is kind of unique to the technology space. When you build a building, the building has some maintenance to it, but the building doesn't become a hole in the ground, right? After 6-7 years of ignoring maintenance. Whereas technology becomes a hole in the ground. It becomes a pit that you fall into. And so we have to balance that in a way that almost no other industry has to deal with. Now, those pitfalls, the common kind of fear inciting things that will cause us to kind of struggle in our journey, that's where we want to focus, because those are going to be the times in which we can make different decisions as leaders, and we can save ourselves in the future by making the right decisions now. That doesn't necessarily mean higher cost now. It just means making a slightly different decision. Now, the first one is when technology is misaligned with business goals. Give you a great example. I've met a bunch of companies, and I do mean a bunch, probably close to 100 at this point, who have built their own ERP system. Now, it sometimes is a great idea. Now, if you're an ERP software company, it is a great idea. That's your product. But if you're a different type of company, a manufacturing company or a software company, while there might be a strong pull from your IT if they're builder centric to build an ERP, the cost benefit is almost never there unless there's some unique differentiator to the business. And so when you end up with this technology choices that are misaligned with business goals, they end up becoming a hindrance, because the amount you can spend to build and maintain an ERP system versus the amount that the big ERP systems are spending to stay innovative is drastically different. That's actually where the entire software as a service industry came from, was the idea that if you could arbitrage the cost for an innovative solution across 1,000 customers, every customer gets better than they could have built themselves, and you get to run the profitable company that's selling it to them. And so that's where the SAPs and Acumaticas and Workdays and all of those came from, was this idea to arbitrage the cost of maintenance and the cost of development across a greater number of accounts, a greater number of customers. When you're the only one footing the bill, you've got to make sure that that bill is in alignment with your business goals. And when I say the only one, I mean your company. When that misalignment happens, a lot of really negative things happen. You end up feeling kind of beholden to this technology. It's hard to get out of those. And so you sign up for this kind of larger than expected long-term bill. So we see this a lot. And so one of the ways that we go about that is kind of some strategic platform planning and strategic infrastructure planning, almost always starting with business goals. Because without understanding what you need to do, it's almost impossible to pick the right technology choices to get you there. Now, the second one seems incredibly apt today, which is we see a lot of folks chasing trends. Now, this is not a new phenomenon with the AI wave. Anybody that was around in the 2000s, late 2000s, saw the Silverlight craze where everybody was trying to, build these deep experiences on the web. And that wave crashed very quickly because there were better technologies being innovated right behind it. And so if you focus on the latest fad, right, we got a lot of phone calls that said, hey, I need to put AI in my application, or I need to put a chatbot on my website. It's like, okay, why? Because without that kind of business need, chasing that trend can become incredibly wasteful. You'll actually miss opportunities to leverage less trending technologies for greater impact. And your returns on those investments in IT will be lower. This is, oddly enough, one of the things that the IT group, kind of IT profession has a bad rap for, which is not focusing on ROI and business value. If we go through and look at a project, the number one thing that we're going to try and do is make sure that the ROI is there and help those folks tell the story to justify the budget. Because if we can't do that, the better answer for the customer is actually not to build it or to build it differently. And so this chasing of trends ends up driving some significantly bad behavior. The downside to that is it's really cool. Inside the IT team, inside the technology team, these are the latest trends. They're going to impact the world, and we know it. We can see it coming. And so we have this strong pull to want to play with them, to want to implement them, to want to try different things. And so I'm not saying don't chase those trends, but chase them by focusing on what you need them to do, not because they're shiny. Now, a couple of real world examples to kind of take this into brass tacks. And I want to dig into this. I've anonymized these because these are true stories that we've seen over the last couple of years, but I think they highlight it specifically. Now, aging technology has a tendency to cost us time and energy. Now, it doesn't do so immediately, right? If I've got an iPhone, I didn't buy the newest iPhone, and I really haven't felt any pain from that decision, right? I saved the money I would spend on that new phone and I put it in savings, so I haven't felt any negatives. Now, your IT group investments inside your company are very, very similar. You're not going to feel those pains immediately. I'm going to reduce my maintenance costs. I'm going to reduce my new innovation costs. I'm going to reduce my investment in platform upgrades and those kind of things. These have a tendency to be these very long, slow curves of depreciation, where in year 3, year 4, you might feel some pain, but it's still not overcoming the savings. And then you have an acceleration of pain once you hit that tipping point. Typically, that's in the 6 to 7 years behind the middle of the market, when tools you're using stop being significantly maintained by the vendors, where you're forced into rate hikes because you're on technology that's now captive and there's no better options without a significant amount of effort. Or you end up kind of into this even further down that slide, being so locked in that there are very few people available who understand the tech that you're in, and you have to effectively create new technology rather than being able to upgrade and iterate on what you have. It is cheaper and easier to start over, but still very expensive by comparison. And so while you can avoid the maintenance costs for a while, they have a tendency to stack on themselves logarithmically in that kind of 7-year window. So the idea behind this is really to focus in on, where are you over 7 years old? You can probably go out, if you're 7 years old, technology today is going to be you're hosted in a cloud somewhere or in a virtualized environment on the edge. You've got on-prem maybe, but you've got Kubernetes, you've got containerization, you've got a data warehouse, you've got kind of all these bits and pieces of your infrastructure so that you can leverage AI analytics and real-time streaming platforms like Confluent or data solutions like Snowflake. Right? There's an underlying assumption of a certain level of maturity in your technology to do so. If you don't have that maturity, the cost to adopting those technologies is huge. And in some cases is actually the end of the conversation. We were talking to a middle market, somewhat large manufacturer. So they're in the 500 to 800 million space. And they were looking at trying to drive efficiencies and quality in their manufacturing space. And so you're talking about Internet of Things and sensors on all their machines and those kind of things, which was great as a concept. But then when we go through and we look at their capital investment on a lot of their heavy duty tools, their inventory tracking systems, their yield management process, time after time after time, we're having these conversations and we find, oh, that's still on paper. That's still in an Excel sheet that's disconnected and that data is not available anywhere. Oh, those machines aren't connected. They're not smart machines and PLC controlled. They're human operated or simple control system type machines that don't report data back. And so the cost to get where they wanted to go, because they felt that would be innovative, meant an entire replacement of their warehouse management with a digital system that would allow them to track that. It meant moving their accounting and yield systems into their digital tools and their ERPs. It meant upgrading or replacing a lot of capital intense hardware. And so the cost to go from where they were to where they wanted to be was astronomical, right? It was $25-30 million. And for a $5 to $8 million manufacturing company, that's a really big upgrade. That's a huge capital expense. Now, had they over the years spent, $200,000, $500,000 a year compounding, the price tag would have been way lower because they wouldn't have been outside of that 7-year and 10-year window on their hardware. It's that lack of investment incrementally that causes that big balloon payment to get larger when you finally do have to take the outdated technology to current to take advantage of some of the innovation trends that are going on now. And so we worked with these folks to incrementally start moving them because the price tag of moving them all in one step was significantly harder. And that's that trade-off between immediate results versus that investment recovery. Now, another example in this space, before I dive into the other example, I want to point you to Andy is actually going to talk about this, the streamlining of cloud data and application integration next week, like 7 days from right now, talking about how to make those incremental investments and how to do it well so that you don't end up with we're held back by our technology and have this big price tag to take advantage of modern day. And so he's going to have the whole thing of how do you build for a platform that can be expandable? It doesn't have to be expensive, but if it's built right, it can grow with you. And so you can eat that incremental expense over time. Now, another example that I want to dive into about where this has kind of shown up for us in the last 2 years is poor data practices. The consequences of poor data practices are amplifying more and more. There was this big data movement, right, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, mid 2010s. Big data, get all the data, get a data warehouse, get data analytics, get Hadoop, get a Spark cluster, all these fun things. But poor practices, poor implementations in like your Power BI stack or doing it all as ETL, ELT batch jobs ended up creating this problem where your data vision, your resolution, your frequency was off from what the business needed. And so without good management and governance and tools, you're held back by this. And the example that showed up in the last 2 years is we were talking with a bank and they wanted to start building some AI models to predict things like fraud and account upsells and service spread and percentage of wallet, all the things that a bank would want. But then we start doing the data analysis and we realize they've got 9 source systems for data. They've got manual processes that are still Excel sheets on different folks' computers in different departments. They've got this long running handoff system, no data warehouse that pulls all this together. And the same concepts had never been kind of solidified. So an account in one system was actually not an account in another, right? And so by trying to map all that together, you now have to overcome bad data practices to even be able to start working on models on that data. One of the things we've seen is that for the vast majority of AI projects, about 80% of the spend is in data and data engineering, right? Whether you want real-time and dynamic pricing or you want a customer sales assistant to help your brokers and reps to grow your business, unless the data is pretty well defined and cleaned, that's going to be very difficult. Now, it doesn't have to be all the data in your entire organization, but it does have to be the slices of data that you're going to be working on. And so you can incrementally approach this. But good data practices are going to be very similar to good cybersecurity practices in the next 5 years. Without them, your business is going to be held back monumentally. You're going to be at risk to falling behind because if the models that we're seeing in the machine learning and the generative AI space and kind of the innovation continues, then as these models are built and shared with the world, you and I aren't going to use different models, probably because we're not not writing our own models. We're going to tune them to our data. So our uniqueness, our competitive advantage is going to be in what unique data sets I can bring to the table about my customers and my employees and my segment of the market that other people don't have access to. They might have the same model. They don't have the same data. And so I'm getting better results. Without good data practices, you're going to lose more and more of that competitive advantage. Now, the reason I bring that one up is Rich McCraw, 2 weeks from now, right now, is actually going to be digging into what does a modern data platform look like. I hear this term all the time. And for a long time, I was like, okay, modern data platform is a good database in the cloud, or it's, the Fabric platform or Snowflake or all that. Rich is going to get into the details and really dive into those evaluation criteria so that you can look at where you're stumbling or where you might stumble in the future and go, all right, what are the steps to get me further down the road? Where do I go from here? Then lastly, one of the big pitfalls we see when people have the platform and they have the data is looking at AI as a one-time investment, looking at it as a spend this year and we're good. Now, the reason that this is problematic is AI is just like any other software. It's very complicated software, but it's just like any other software. It requires maintenance, it requires updates, and it requires continuous improvement. Because over time, models drift. They become worse at the job they were trained on. And so there is this competency of continuing and maintaining. Now you can sidestep that by going, all right, we're going to pay for AI as a service, but that's still an ongoing investment. Whether the AI as a service that you're investing in is Copilot for Microsoft or Gemini for Google, or any of the thousands of AI as a service products that were started last year and the year before that, those are still ongoing investments, right? But believing that you can build it once and not touch it again, it's actually very dangerous when it comes to AI because its errors, its getting outdated is not nearly as visible as some other toolkits. Like you'll get hey, that's no longer a supported component from Microsoft or AWS when they're updating their platforms, or Google Cloud when they're changing out tools. Like you'll get those updates. You'll get proactive communication of, hey, the platform's aging. But with AI, it's going to continue to give you an answer based on what it can, calculate and how you trained it. It's the answer that's going to become less and less relevant, which requires an expert user. Once a user's come to rely on AI and question its answers less, the guardrails of judging that response have a tendency to fall away. This is where you're going to need consistent validation and tools and ongoing maintenance and monitoring to test and measure those outputs. Now, the good news about this is that Scott Poulin, 3 weeks from today, I know we're stacking it up. This is all of your October, your congratulations, is talking about what this looks like. Roadmaps, value cases, and helping with enterprise transformation planning. Because if you pick the coolest things, you probably are going to overspend for the ROI. But if you pick the most high value, the most labor compressing things, you'll likely see ROI that pays for the projects to do the cool things. And Scott's going to jump into that and really kind of dig into those pieces. Now, I've talked about each of these pieces and these problems and a couple of real world examples, but I want to now pivot into kind of a conversation. And so jump into the Q&A and ask any questions you might be thinking of about how this will play out and those kind of things. I'm going to talk about how we approach this, because if all these pitfalls, we see them all the time, how do we avoid them? My hope from this is that you see ways you could avoid them too in your organization. Now, the first one is we take a very strategic approach to technology adoption that prioritizes business objectives and navigates through complexity. There is no one size fits all answer. Anybody that tells you that they've got a tool or they've got a process that always works is selling you something. There isn't a one size fits all. So what we try and do is take an approach that's malleable, but it's focused on 4 parts. Now, you'll have to forgive me the pun of the always improving culture, but it is really something at our core. Now, almost everybody will start in the upper right. They're going to talk about practices. They're going to go, okay, how do we use these tools? How do we use these things? Now that could be your platform, that could be your AI tools, that could be your, QA approaches, that could be your way you leverage your ERP. But those are all practices. They're typically around changing individual things, and they're objectively measurable. What we're hoping to do through practices is to then drive change in structure and mindset. If I implement a practice of checking the quality of the software on a regular basis, my hope is that the collective ownership of quality becomes a mindset, and that we start structuring our teams differently so that we have QA embedded on the teams and that we have higher quality products. So we may not need our administration and operations group in the software and the platform to do as much work on the preventative and the recovery work. They're doing on the intervention and recovery work, they're doing more preventative and planning and future looking work. And so our hope is by changing practice, we're actually going to shift mindset and structure. But the target for all of those transformations is culture. And it's subjective and it's group based, but it's where, as a culture, we've integrated those practices and mindsets so deeply that it becomes self-protecting. When somebody violates a practice, the group around them corrects it, but also then holds them accountable to violating that practice because this has been ingrained into the culture. Now, you can't do this in a sweeping way, and innovation doesn't work in a sweeping way. I can't just go, all right, we're going to be all infrastructure as code tomorrow, because we don't have the practices, the mindset, the structure, or the culture to support that. So what we end up doing is we have to do this in a team by team basis. You start with a team, and that's typically very tactical. It's teaching them the practices. And then as those practices start leaking out into structure and mindset, the business and the leadership groups have to start shifting, because it turns out as the team accomplishes more work and different things and adjusts their expectations, they need more time from the product owner, or they need more executive buy-in on, instead of annual budgeting, quarterly budgeting. Like, it starts to change these. Now, once that's changed on enough teams, you have some program level management that comes in, because those teams as an aggregate end up needing a different structure. And it moves from very prescriptive to very self-determining. And that's why every agile adoption, every digital transformation, they don't look the same, because they iterate through each of these evolutions. Each big technology shift like AI or mobile or the .com boom, which is roughly the equivalent I use for the AI wave right now, goes through these cycles through businesses. Now, the problem with that is if it goes through the cycle and it fails halfway through, like you don't take the next step, it can create a pretty negative conversation around that initiative or that change, right? There are a lot of places where agile is a bad word, not because the values of agile are bad, but because they went partway through this curve and then failed. And whether that partway was 10% or 90%. And so it creates this organizational trauma and scar tissue. So the big thing is making sure that you take these steps incrementally, but also intentionally. When you're getting a few teams to start doing these practices, how are we educating the business and the leadership to evaluate those teams differently, right? Because if my leadership and my business processes are forcing a top-down budgetary approval, known ROI ahead of time, but my R&D in the AI space is still trying to figure it out, those are in conflict. And so if I start pushing my teams to innovate, but then they're being pushed against or away from innovation because of our ingrained processes and leadership, it creates one of those pitfalls that stops us from investing and iterating and starts building up that big balloon payment in our technology stack. Now, to navigate
we do
this,
have one question.
fantastic.
We do have one question that's coming. Anonymous attendee says, I am puzzled as to how any of today's challenges differ from the challenges we face historically. In the 80s, there was digitalization. In the 90s, it was the internet. In the early 2000s, there was mobility. Now there's AI. In other words, what is special about what businesses need to do today versus the best practices of the past?
So it's a great question. And I will say there's a lot that's the same in those waves, right? I'm going to harken back to one of those waves. In the late 70s, early 80s, computers were starting to come into the workforce. And what we saw was this job title show up of computer operator. And then it vanished. Less than 3 to 5 years later, it was just gone. There were no computer operators as a big segment of the job market. We're seeing the same thing today. It's just called platform or prompt engineer. Prompt engineering is going to go away for the same reason computer operator goes away, because everybody became a computer operator. It was just an assumed skill. Prompt engineering is going to go away for the same reason. So a lot of these trends require adapting of business processes. They required adapting of technology approach. They had required some adaptation of technology spending. What we're seeing right now is that there were a few folks who, while those waves required some of those adaptations, if you missed one of those waves, the cost coming due is significant now. Now, that was true in the 90s. There were just less preceding waves in the technology space, so it didn't compound as far. And so if I missed the virtualization in the early 2000s and I missed the containerizations in the 2010s and the infrastructure as code in that space, my cost now to move on-prem is way higher in labor effort, et cetera, even with the acceleration of the tools to help me do it. So there were just less waves in the preceding big changes to compound that cost. Now, the other side is, in most of those cases, the fear of what the technology would do to jobs was largely contained in the IT space. When we were talking about virtualization of servers, there weren't really accountants and lawyers and CFOs worried about what it would do to their jobs, because it didn't translate across domains nearly as well. The same can't be said for AI. When you look at the general capacity of that technology to change much more broadly in business, the fear and the psychological impedance to navigating it well gets a lot higher. Our computer administrators and software developers and QA and PMs have been dealing with those changes that iterate their careers for years now, right? In my roughly 33 years of writing software, I've shifted 9 languages and major platforms. And so you get this kind of, it's okay to have everything change underneath you every 4 to 6 years. That's largely not true outside of the technology space. And so that's where it has this psychological impedance to the market navigating it well that I don't believe existed at this amplitude in previous waves. A lot of the digital transformation pieces did exist in previous waves. And that's one of the reasons that when I look at this is our transformation methodology. It is not our AI methodology or our platform engineering methodology, because it applies to all of them. It is very much, this is like the waves that came before. And while it's a little different, the same tools will help you through it. Feel free to ask a clarifying question.
There are no more questions put into the Q&A section. Yeah, but anybody can pop in. They're all welcome.
Awesome. Now, when we look at the pieces required to navigate this, it's a few things. One, technical expertise matters. It is very hard to build in a new technology that you don't understand. With a little bit of guidance, a little bit of mentorship, you can set yourself up significantly better to achieve the outcomes you're looking for. I look at this a lot like playing golf. I was introduced to playing golf by my dad. My dad's not a great golfer. I'm not a great golfer. But then I had another friend about my age introduced to golf, but his dad got him a coach. And instantly he had a leg up, which meant that he learned faster and he corrected better because there was technical expertise navigating him away from building bad habits that were going to be costly in the long run. And so as you approach some of these kind of technology changes, having technical expertise at the table, It doesn't mean you have to go out and you have to hire the most expensive consultants you can find to come do the work for you. But it does mean that that advisory is probably worth its weight in gold, because 15, 20 minutes, 5 hours of advice can help you avoid hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional expenditure, or even millions of rework. The practical expertise becomes essential. This is how technology will be in the real world. One of my favorite examples to this is I was part of a project very early in my career. We were building a manufacturing system. The entire ROI on this manufacturing system was saving time for somebody in a warehouse who was palletizing and scanning boxes of material. And then they put them up in the storage system, and then they put them on trucks and send them out all over the US. And so the idea was that this digital solution that was on a scanner was going to save them time in the plant. Now, as a very young software developer, I'd never done that job. So we designed and built a system that actually made it much slower. It made it 14 times slower to do that job. And it wasn't until we tried to push it out into the facilities, it was like, oh, this isn't going to work, because we didn't see how it was going to interact in the real world. And we actually had to go back and redo and change significant portions of it to adjust for what it actually needed to do with users. That piece of practical application, this is typically going to come from your COO, your operators, your VP of ops, who are going to go, okay, but what does it actually change in the job when we do that? And so you need that voice in the room. And then the strategic thinking, which is, and what's the long term? What's the next 3 or 4 steps? You don't want to fall in love with those next 3 or 4 steps, right? But you do want to know what they are so that you can take the first steps well. There's a big difference in how you build technology. If you're building it for 100 users, than the way you build it if you're building it for 100 million users. And so knowing what the next 4 or 5 steps are, is this a stopgap kind of solution that we're going to throw away in a few years and that's okay because we're implementing an ERP that'll replace it? Or is this going to live with our company and need to grow and expand? Simply knowing what the strategic vision is helps you to then balance the technical, how do I get there, and the practical, how does this impact people? And when you can pull those 3 into the room and kind of pick where you're heading in the technology landscape, it will help you to avoid a lot of potholes, a lot of pitfalls, save you a couple of broken legs and some scars. And ultimately speaking, that's the goal, right? We've got so much technology available at our fingertips today that we can spend an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of money building cool tech. But if it doesn't move our business forward, if it doesn't make the jobs and lives of the folks working in that business faster and easier, then is it really worth doing? It might be cool, it might be shiny, but it's probably not something that I'm going to spend money on. So I'm going to leave question time just here for a few minutes, and then everybody will get a break and be able to take a restroom break, and then kind of take the next 5-10 minutes and schedule your time to attend Andy and Rich and Scott's deeper dive into each of these pieces.
There is another question that has come in.
Awesome.
What's more important? What's more important, to catch the wave like AI as it's cresting, or wait until the form of the wave is clarified? Where are we at right now with the AI wave?
It's a great question. I'm going to say it depends because I'm a consultant, but I'm going to give you more details, I promise. So it depends on what type of business you run. If your business is kind of very much about the innovative edge and you're in a hyper competitive, like red ocean kind of business, think about this as like marketing agencies and trying to get people's attention, right? The SEO space. Every tiny advantage gains you a huge amount in that space. And so you might actually want to be an early adopter and experimenting far more than your more traditional businesses like construction, manufacturing, utilities, those kind of things. So I look at how close to innovation is your business's differentiator. If your business's differentiator is not on the forefront of innovation, wait for the wave to define itself. Wait for the kind of tried and true, these are proven technologies to become apparent, and then invest in them. By the way, this is a lot of what large businesses do, even Microsoft. Microsoft does a lot of innovative things, but they're known in the world for looking and watching the market. And when somebody really does it well, whatever it is, they buy them and integrate them, because the cost of trying and failing 50 times is actually higher than the cost of buying somebody who's proven they can do it. Right. And so you see this with a lot of different innovative technology companies, is they have some internal innovation that's incremental, but the disruptive innovation, they buy into their business once it's been defined. And that's all about where on that curve they are. Right. Microsoft wants to be leading edge, not bleeding edge, because the majority of their customers are actually pretty risk averse. And so they're filling into that funnel. Google, same way. AWS, very similar. And so where are we in the curve is the other half of this question. So we have jumped the chasm, right? AI is not going anywhere. For anybody that doesn't know what I'm talking about, there's an adoption curve for technology, and there's kind of a break in the very early adopters, like the tech forward kind of tech geeks in your life. This is the person when you're like, hey, the new iPhone's coming out, I'm going to call Bob. Bob's going to know everything there is to know about the new iPhone because Bob's that kind of tech geek, right? So my tech geek in my life, Robin, when there's new tech, she's going to tell me about it. I may not buy it, but she's on that forefront. Once it jumps the chasm, it starts going on this adoption curve, and will kind of broadly hit its base. That chasm is about it proving its usability to the market. AI has proven its usability. Now, there's a whole bunch of fluff and marketing and really bad ideas being built on AI today. But at its core, generative AI is going to make a significant impact on kind of the white collar working space over the next 1 to 3 years, and then expand through making the jobs in manufacturing and logistics and a whole bunch of closer to blue collar type work that's going to shift pretty heavily over the next 5 to 7 years. So AI is kind of proven that it's past the chasm, but it's still on the early side of the wave. So what I do is I typically, if you're a kind of risk averse company, wait for it to crest the top of the wave. And if you're an innovative company or want the perception of being innovative, maybe you're a little earlier. Very few companies should be spending ahead of it jumping the chasm. So if you know that space, we're in the early adopters post chasm on the technology adoption curve. And we are at the top of the Gartner hype cycle as well. So you hear a ton of hype about AI. You're actually going to hear that conversation shift in the next 9 to 12 months around return on investment and AI solutions. It won't be AI potential anymore. They'll be talking about proven solutions with case studies, because that's going to be what the market pushes towards as we go through that trough of disillusionment as the hype comes down.
For software consultants, do you foresee that in the coming years, while still delivering software solutions to problems, there will be a shift of focus from writing software to fine-tuning existing large models, or maybe writing smaller ML models tailored for specific business cases?
I'm going to answer this in 2 parts, because the question, oddly enough, I can answer yes to one side of it and no to another. So do I believe that this is going to drastically shift writing software in the next 3 years? Yes. I don't believe that you will largely be on the front end of the industry in software if you cannot use AI to help you write software. Just like most people today use a modern IDE or individual development environment to write their software. They're not doing it in Notepad and a command line any longer for the vast majority of people. We're going to see that same tectonic shift that we saw with the advent of Java Eclipse and Visual Studio to change the way people wrote software. And it made everybody faster. AI is going to do very similar. If you're in this space and you're curious and you're like, hey, I'm a little more technically bent, take a look at like the AI-enabled development environment Cursor. It's getting a ton of hype and praise right now, and it's actually very good. But it allows you to use AI collaboratively in the art of writing software. Do I believe that's going to be a hands down shift to only working with models? No. Models are great at a few things, but they're actually really, really terrible to the point of being useless in most others. When I need a deterministic yes or no answer to a question, models typically aren't great at that. I can do some things with classifiers and all that, but like generative AI, if I want the same answer every time, generative AI is the wrong solution. Cluster with confidence is great in machine learning, but it's not always the answer. And so what we're going to see is places in software that were traditionally like rules engine based and those kind of things will very much tilt more towards machine learning models. And most development, most applications will actually integrate traditional software development, object oriented development, front end skills, all that, and the ability to integrate machine learning services and generative AI services into the application, because the users are going to push us for that kind of usability and those kinds of interactions. So the developers will still need those kind of core development and computer science skills. By the way, that's been true at every major cycle. When we went from kind of the double E dominance of electrical engineers in computer science to software engineers, and then object-oriented programming, every time there's this big fear that it would do away with the engineering discipline of our industry. And it didn't. What it did do was massively amplify the number of developers needed in our industry. I think this is going to do the same, because we still have this massive amount of software needed to solve big problems in the world and not enough software developers to do so. The value of a software developer has never been their typing speed. It has been about thinking through a problem and coming up with an approach that's logical and concise and congruent. The AI models rapidly accelerate typing speed, but they don't do the second part. And there's very little indicator in the market that they're going to do that next part in the next 5 years. I'm going to hand it back to you, Daniel. Thank you, everybody.
I want to thank you all for joining us, especially Devlin Liles for sharing this insightful presentation with us. Make sure to reach out directly to him to discuss how you can align your technology decisions with your business goals for maximum value. And coming up next week, we have Andy Hasten, Technical Director, with his webinar, Platform Engineering Excellence, Streamlining Cloud, Data, and App Integration. Andy will explore the pillars of modern platform engineering and share best practices for optimizing performance while ensuring flexibility and resilience. Sign up for this webinar and or the whole global platform series at improving.com/thoughts/webinars. Once again, that's improving.com/thoughts/webinars. Until next time, everyone, have a great rest of your day.